Well, welcome back. My name is Sheldon McLeod, and this is Thinking Out Loud here, presented to you exclusively by the SaltWire Network. And I've mentioned before that I do other work with SaltWire, and well, some of that other work includes I won't call it a monologue, because that would insinuate it's funny, because it's sometimes about serious issues going on. I just happened to be at a comedy show last Sunday night, and I wrote about Derek Edwards, and I just happened to watch a documentary earlier in the day, and it was about people and political correctness and cancel culture. That's kind of where the inspiration came from. But unfortunately for me, sometimes I forget about what else is happening around the world. And well, it turns out Dave Chappelle was once again in the news, and I'm not sure if some of the reaction I got was because of that. But for the most part, I have been a stand-up comedian fan for years. The story I like to tell is my mother, who was single at the time, had gone out, and I ran across her collection of records, and I found George Carlin's AM FM. And I was probably 6, 7, 8 years old, probably totally inappropriate for me to be listening to that. But that's kind of where it started for me. And then over the years, obviously growing up in the 80s and some of the big marquee stand-up comedians, I went back and rewatched Eddie Murphy's Delirious. There are parts of that are still funny. Parts of it do not stand up to the test of time. And is that about political correctness? Is that about the benchmarks of society moving? Is that about perhaps our society taking a look at some of the things that were, well, quite honestly, intolerant, and the way that we laugh at them? All of this to say, I was looking for someone to help me kind of work through this issue of comedy and cancel culture, and I was blessed enough to find Carolyn Davis. Carolyn Davis is here to join the conversation. She is a stand-up comedian here in Halifax, and you may have seen her on a stage near you. And I want to talk a little bit about where you're going to be performing next, Carolyn, but thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So for you, the intersection of comedy, and we briefly were chatting yesterday in this idea that philosophy and comedy and, the modern day philosopher versus the modern stand-up comedian. Are we putting too much pressure on stand-up comedians to be a representation of our society, do you think?
Yes.
Okay, this is going to be a really boring interview if I get one-word answers. But no, I appreciate it. Okay, so why? Tell me why you might feel that way.
Well, I'd like to back it up just a little bit and just say that as soon as you use the term counterculture or cancel culture, sorry, not counterculture, cancel culture, immediately you'll get some people's backs up, because it's often been used as the right to criticize the left. So I try to keep those buzzwords out of things. But are comedians under a lot more
scrutiny?
More scrutiny? Sure, thank you.
No worries.
I should have had another coffee before this interview. There's no doubt about it that we are. But I think the question is, why are we? And I think the reason that we are is the advent, of course, social media, being able to share things on our cell phone so easily, and especially being able to share small bits of our performances out of context. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what gets a lot of comedians into trouble, is just that there's something that's said out of context. Any one sentence could mean something good or bad, depending on the context that it's given. So, I mean, there's that. Do we have to be more careful? I think that, the world is under pressure to be more careful. The world is under pressure to be better people. Mm-hmm. But I think that politics gets in the way an awful lot. To say one thing out of a 60-minute set that somebody finds offensive, or because we're all human, we're all capable of making mistakes, maybe we just chose the wrong word. And there are people out there, they'll jump over the one word that you chose. And sometimes those words are obvious, and we will do our very best not to say them. And often, if they're not a part of a person's vernacular, they're not going to come out anyway. Mm-hmm. But there are other people that, they didn't read the latest left-wing newsletter that states the words that we're not allowed to say this week. Now, I kid because there is no such publication, but sometimes it feels that way. If you're engaged in just a normal conversation and somebody calls you out because of a word that you used in the sentence, and you're using that word in a totally innocuous way, and it's a word you've used your whole life, and people are suddenly saying, no, well, choose different words.
Right.
And that's one thing. But if somebody then says, because you chose that word, you're evil, you're awful, and there's no redeeming you forever because you said that word once. We can be judged for our best. We can be judged for our worst. We can be judged for how funny we are. We can be judged for how political we are. We can be judged for how evil we are. I think that honestly, that all of that's fair. It's all fair game. People can leave a show and feel however they want to feel. People are justified in feeling however they want to feel. And there's nothing really comedians can do about that except just to try to do their best.
And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I guess was maybe, and I don't want to use trigger as a word because that's also, loaded. But when I said, watching stand-up since I was a kid, and it feels like we started to get back to an understanding that we can all vote with our wallets and our attention when it comes to what we find funny versus what we think offensive. And I think that might have been perhaps less nuanced and maybe perhaps it downplays some of what platforming people does. I guess the difference between being evocative and being provocative is partly at the heart of what we're talking about today.
Oh, absolutely. And also, we have to also be sensitive to the fact that while many of us can vote with our wallets, some people don't have an awful lot of money to do that. Right. So it's we can't all vote with our wallets. And where some wallets are bigger than others, that just means that people are supposed to then have more influence and more pull. And maybe that's just an inherent truth in our society that we can't get around as long as capitalism is the system that we use. And I'm not a political comedian. I will say things because I'm transgender. I will say things about my own situation. But I'll also end every show or most of my shows with the only bit of advice that I give to anybody in the show, which is, the best advice I can give to you is don't take my advice. I'm a comedian. I'm here to make you laugh. I'm not here to make you, to tell you how to live your life. I'll give you an alternative perspective to maybe one that you've been thinking about. And that's really where comedy comes from, and from counterculture, from looking at things from a different lens, from looking at things and finding the humor in a situation. Some people would argue that, comedy is anger and it's all about anger. I'm not sure I believe that completely because, I think any emotion can be behind comedy. Mm-hmm.
I'm looking to, Lenny Bruce and the fact that, and this documentary highlighted the fact that this was a man who on a stage at a comedy club after midnight said words that were deemed offensive. He was arrested. He went to jail over that. And this documentary said, well, that was the last time in history that's happened. But to use one of the other examples that I gave of Dave Chappelle and some of the pushback, the severe pushback he received over his specials, people have said by simply saying those words, you are harming a population. He says, I'm not a transphobe, that he uses words like, well, I'm inclusive. I'm just leveling the playing field and I'm poking fun at everyone. So you're being included. And I know you have an answer to that, Carolyn.
Well, it's easy for a person of privilege with a lot of money who has a large audience to get up there and to say whatever they like. But there is a level of accountability. Freedom of speech. We can say whatever we want, but that doesn't mean that we're free from the repercussions of what we say. Some of those repercussions could be legal if you're making death threats, for example. Some of those would be more social reactions, whether that be, oh, we don't want to see this person. We don't want to pay to see them anymore because I didn't like what they had to say. Mm-hmm. And that can happen for any number of reasons. This is just one more thing that could give a person a chance to tune out. As far as the comedian that you mentioned, I'm not a big fan of his attitudes or Ricky Gervais's either. It's you can level the playing field, but and you can make fun of whomever you really like. But it's, the same old story. A person should be punching up, not down. And, trans people, we're going through a hard time in a lot of different ways. And do we really need somebody pointing out the ways or the reasons to other people why we shouldn't be accepted? You know, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say it's nuanced and it can be complicated, but people know what feels right. People understand, and they know right away if it's over a line. And you would know this better than I, that on a stage there would be something you've said, either you're working through a bit or you're trying to reframe something and it doesn't come out right. And I've done that myself. It's a little different if it's on a live radio program and it goes out, or if it's on something that I produce and I, recorded in my studio at my home where I don't have the feedback. And maybe that's where I need to take a second look at, where my position came from, what it was that I was basing that on. And my opinion may have been right in the moment, but without recognizing the harms that others have received because of the actions and the words of others. And I'm not trying to look for somebody to justify what I did, but just to kind of get a sense of what it's like for you and for other stand-up comedians in the face of these other superstars who are finding multi-million-dollar deals and large stages and audiences when they say things that don't sit well with an entire group.
And that's all fair. And comedians have to walk a very fine line. I mean, we have to know where the line is. We've got to be willing to walk right up to that line. And sometimes we have to put our foot across it for the sake of the shock value of what we're saying. Normally, when we do that, it's meant with a flavor of sarcasm. If a person, expressed, wow, I've got a really great feeling because of all of these fires happening. I'm going to save so much on butane when I'm starting my barbecues. No, I just have to move to BC. Well, what an insensitive thing to say. I mean, the danger, the damage to the environment, the damage to people's health and everything else. But it's a joke. I mean, because obviously nobody's going to do that. Nobody's, it's looking for something, a spark of light in something awful. But once you go to that something awful, you're opening the floodgates for people to say, well, now you're making it sound like our world doesn't need people to be more conscious of the environment and things like that. And it's like, no, I'm just making a joke. I'm not telling people how to think. I'm telling people, I'm twisting some words around to make things funny, or at least trying to make things funny.
Yeah, I get the sense that's a lot like, I'm only asking questions, but the evocative nature of the questions are designed to point people in a certain direction. So thank you for helping shine that or put that mirror up to my face to show me exactly what it is that I might have been missing. And all of this to say, you're someone who performs on stage here in Halifax, and I'm just curious what the other comics, the other people doing the same thing, think of this idea, and I won't use the terminology, but the idea that someone might not like a joke to the point where they want you not just to apologize, but to not do that ever again, to lose that platform entirely.
I've had some discussions with some other comics locally here, but and I don't pretend for a moment to speak for their minds. But in the general conversations I've had, I haven't really met anybody who's too concerned about it in a local level. Right. And I'm not aware of any local comics here that have gotten into a lot of trouble over something that's been in their set. If I dug enough, hey, maybe there is out there, but I don't think it's a large concern. I do know that sometimes when events happen, I might talk to the comedy friend that's next to me and say, in light of what happened yesterday with this, do you really think it's okay if I bring up joke number 3?
Right.
And I don't think I've ever encountered a time when somebody hasn't said, if it was funny yesterday, then do it today. Mm-hmm. I think that the formula for making the decision of whether to say that joke is more complicated than that.
Right.
You do have to think about the periphery. I want people to have fun at my shows. I want them to laugh. I want them to leave with a smile on their face. Laughter is the best medicine, the best way to get rid of stress. I don't want to cause anybody more stress. And if I happen to, well, I'm sorry. I don't, it's never the intention.
Again, thank you so much for engaging in the conversation. I love nothing more than to have people, and that's why I call this Thinking Out Loud, just to give people something to think about, perhaps something they hadn't considered, a perspective that they don't perhaps hold themselves. And that's ultimately what this is about. So, Carolyn, just for the sake of as we wrap this up, where can people see you perform next? When will you be taking a stage?
Well, I do a bi-weekly show at a Halifax bar and grill called District 5.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be there this Thursday, and the show starts at 8. There is no cover charge, but you're really better off at calling the bar and booking a seat, because we normally fill up.
Carolyn Davis, thank you so much for helping us today and for sharing with me, and it's a real pleasure to meet you. I really appreciate this.
My absolute pleasure. Anytime.